Hello, welcome to the podcast from the Internationalist Workers Group, where we discuss current events in the United States and around the world from a Marxist and communist perspective. The IWG is the U.S. affiliate of the Internationalist Communist Tendency, which is an international organization for the constitution of an international working class party. We aim to provide not only information that would be relevant for the working class in the United States, but also criticism of the media and the coverage of events by bourgeois sources. Our aim is to discuss a broader range of issues in a less formal structure than would be found in our literature or periodicals. However, the topics we discuss will always be relevant to revolutionary working class politics and the criticism of the current state of affairs in this country and abroad. And today we have Tom.
Hi, guys.
We have Aisha.
Hi, guys.
And myself, Seamus. And so why don't we get started right away on the U.S. economy. So obviously we have a quote-unquote debate going on whether or not we are in a recession currently, seemingly because the economists just want to change the definition arbitrarily, which to me, of course, just indicates, or it just shows sort of the typical method of the economists is that everything is just arbitrary and that doesn't follow any actual scientific methodology other than, whatever model fits in the moment.
Well, if they acknowledged the internal logic of capitalist development, then they would have to be communists. So sometimes it's fun to watch them from a distance do these little dances. And yeah, you see like right now, first quarter growth for this year for gross domestic product, GDP, was 1.6%. And the second quarter growth recently announced by the Fed was 0.9%. That was first quarter growth is negative as well. Like the standard definition of a recession, is two negative growth periods, which we have at negative 0.16 and negative 0.09% growth. But at the immediate response to this from the Biden White House was to hand wave it away as not a recession with not much further said. And I kind of think it's really showing where the numbers are coming from to dance around this topic. Because if you remove the influence of housing and groceries from the GDP, then it apparently paints a much rosier picture. And that's a lovely thought when your biggest financial concern is your stock portfolio.
Yeah,
of course. To add on to that, they have this really super vague definition, recession. I'm just going to quote what they said. Involves a significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and lasts more than a few months. What does that even mean? It's so vague as to not have any meaning. It's a complete cope, and really, it's just to make it sort of seem as if the financial crisis isn't as bad as it actually is.
Yeah, and they'll go ahead and cite all kinds of other metrics without, diving into detail. Of course, I think the biggest one they love to tout is, but we're adding so many more jobs. And, that doesn't cover things like people working multiple jobs for extremely low wages, people doing piecework, just all these things where working class people are totally squeezed by this. But, they can just say, more jobs. So thus we are not in a recession, among some other things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hasn't there been an increase in gig economy jobs?
Yes.
There has, and contract labor in general has also been on the rise, which just puts working people in the position where some of them are making more in terms of raw dollars, but without benefits and with worse working conditions and without security. And in healthcare, it's increasingly become like a migrant workforce traveling from state to state and pursuing contract labor. And it's affecting thousands of people. But because those jobs exist, then, it must be a good thing.
Not to mention how a lot of jobs, the way they're structured is to prevent you from getting full-time hours. Like, they sort of cap you at a certain amount, less than 40, simply so they don't need to provide you with benefits or what a full-time employee would get.
The magic number in my state is 32 hours. 32 hours, and they don't have to provide you with benefits. That's 4 full-time days a week.
It's awful.
And, like we were saying before, that they like kind of tiptoe around this subject. But it's funny that, like, while the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is the primary driver of crisis in general, one of the contributing factors to the current crisis is overproduction, and bourgeois economic outlets have been alluding to that. There was large amounts of stockpiling during COVID due to fear that there would be a loss of availability during the pandemic. And now we have all of these warehouses full of unsold stock, eating up space that would otherwise be used for resources that people actually need. Like, God only knows there's warehouses out there filled with toilet paper.
Yeah, I mean, companies are accumulating at a lower rate, sort of indicating that, they can't maintain everything they've been sort of hoarding throughout the pandemic. And like you said, all of this is just going to go to waste because, they're not just going to, out of the goodness of their hearts, they're of course not going to do anything with it unless they can sell it. And, they're going to do that they hope to make up for the losses they had in what they accumulated, but ultimately they're just not going to be able to because there's just too much. They can't, other firms who want their surplus or who would want their surplus capital, they won't be able to do anything with it. So ultimately, they're just going to end up at large in a crisis. The same it's been since the 70s.
See, this really just reinforces the idea that the only thing that would solve this issue is abolishing capitalism, because otherwise, using a form of production that's based on profit, it just leads to the excessive waste that you just mentioned, and not to mention food waste as well, and which is awful for the environment. It's all like tied together, and there's no way to really solve this crisis within the parameters of capitalism itself, because it's simply going to continue happening as it always has throughout history with these fluctuations in the market.
So, like, that point, Aisha, like that totally like goes into like what used to be referred to as the anarchy of production, like going back to like as early as Engels, even though I kind of associate that concept more with like Bukharin and Lenin and the Russian Revolution. The desire to like free ourselves from the anarchy of that production where there isn't like an underlying logic. And like the last 150 years has just shown us that no degree of economic planning, while the basis of a society is still capitalist in nature, like still fundamentally based on exchange for value, is just not possible. And it really only leaves us with the option of like communism and the workers seizing the means of production to hopefully produce something more logical and based more on need than on profit margins, quarterly profit margins on top of that.
Exactly, because if we were to abolish capitalism, obviously this won't be done immediately. We're not going to be able to immediately implement like a mode of production that's based that on social use rather than profit. That will take some time, and there is a period of transition that's necessary. But even then, producing products for producing commodities for their use rather than their exchange value will be the thing to prevent that sort of accumulation of excessive waste. So it's essentially just destroying the environment as well as making it impossible for people to survive.
Yeah, and so sort of on that note, the prices of commodities, particularly food, are of course high, very high right now, and they are increasing. And as we commonly call it in this bourgeois society, inflation. Now, this is something that is really hurting people, working class people, of course. I think it's a little bit interesting that something Tom said earlier, or maybe it was Aisha, you know, we see things like CEO compensation remaining very, very high, and typically it's tied to stock. So a CEO gets their compensation, quote unquote, as stock. And so that ties back to speculation. So when capital is no longer actually profitable, it's no longer productive, and as we are seeing, we get an increase in speculation, we get more and more to the brink of a serious event such as what happened in 2008. And, you know, this is all going to like come back to bite the bourgeoisie. We obviously hope that it becomes more than just something they can put a Band-Aid on, and that it will allow the working class to kind of make a serious move toward political organization and revolution. But in the meantime, you know, the working class is just going to get squeezed and squeezed. They're going to barely be able to afford food and housing, and it's just, you know, it just immiserates the rest of us while these financialization efforts just speculate as to, you know, if we move money over here, then we might get some squeeze a little bit more profit out.
And, you know, like bringing up like financialization and inflation, like this isn't the first time we've played this game. We had the housing crash in 2007, 2008, but that was like what triggered that was mortgage-backed securities, which were speculative investment portfolios. And, you know, they were tied to mortgages that were given with variable APRs and to people who could barely afford them in the first place. And we're kind of seeing something similar happen again with bourgeois financial institutions interfering with the housing market, where home prices have skyrocketed. And I think some degree of that was initially based on finding like that ideal renter in like mid-sized cities in the suburbs who works a coastal distance job and can bring their like California or like New York money to a landlocked state and afford to pay more because they're still making that city salary. But like that doesn't like account for all of it. And when you look at like where homes are going and where they're being purchased from and by whom, like there's like entire companies right now spending billions purchasing American homes, something like 15% of all American homes, with the intention of renting them to the people who would have purchased them in the first place. And like this increased economic activity has like added to demand for housing, which has just ballooned those prices up further. So now people selling are getting cash offers for 10 grand, 15 grand over asking from these companies that will make back their margins in something like 10 years through the rental income. So like even for sections of the working class that couldn't be in the position to attempt to purchase a home, which I think right now is probably a pretty substantial segment of the working class itself, this has like a trickle down effect on rents. So even if you can't afford to buy a home, you're now renting from these homes that are being valued at like 15 to 20% more than what they would have previously been worth. And like this effect is like disproportional to more marginalized, lower income communities, and disproportionately to communities of color. And then on top of all of that, if you do think that maybe you can buy a home to get out of this like trap of like paying rent to a landlord just to have a roof over your head, like you have to somehow make that money and save that money while we have 9% inflation and the average American home is, in terms of real dollars, has 500 less a month. It's an impossible trap, and it stinks of 2007 all over again with the financial institutions meddling in the housing market.
Yeah, I see it all the time. Someone close to me is being forced to move, someone who's a renter, and she's being forced to move because her landlord wants to sell to some investor, someone who's going to do the exact same thing you're describing. It's just not going to work out how they think it is, and it's ultimately just going to produce this massive immiseration.
Exactly.
Yeah, on the road to a new bubble burst is paved with homeless workers right now.
Oh my God. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that, Tom and Seamus. I also wanted to add on the fact that housing prices are going up, but wages are not. Wages are either stagnant or even for some people it's even less because of course employers cut costs when they're not making cut wages when they're not making enough profit. One of the ways to counter the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. But I mean, they can't really fight against that without really, because not only are they in competition with all the other businesses that are doing the same thing, it's that, and like that's like, you know, contributing to the overall financial crisis. The working class, we are the ones who are suffering because of this.
And, you know, back to Marx, that's exactly what causes a revolution. The working class will not just fold. I mean, we will fight to survive. So, you know, it sort of speaks to the desperation of the bourgeoisie to keep the system afloat by any means necessary.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they have no other choice but to be like the capitalist class because, you know, they're like, this conversation is taking us like back to basics. Like this is Capital Volume 1. Like with the increased immiseration of workers and the logic of capital keeps the capitalists' hands tied as well. They have no choice but to like act in the mechanisms that are like underpinning the system. So like the whole system is just designed to fall.
Yeah, it literally is. Like, sorry to interrupt, but yeah, you're right. Capitalism contains its undoing in the way it's set up because of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. But I can't remember, what was that term? Organic composition?
The organic composition of capital.
Yes, the organic composition of capital.
The organic composition, and Tom, you might want to correct me if I'm wrong, it's basically how much capital is tied up in constant capital, so assets.
Yeah.
Correct. It's the machines, it's the
ratio.
warehouses, it's all the fixed expenses. Like a profit can't be derived from any of that. Like profit is derived from like the money that's taken in advance of that. And then capital gets into like intercapitalist like advances tend to increase that reliance on machines and technology and logistics and warehouses and transit systems and all of that to a point where like a single institution has to take in billions before they see their first dollar of profit. Meaning the amount of immiseration, like the amount that the working class has to be squeezed to generate that profit constantly increases while that profit itself constantly falls.
Welcome, Andromeda. We have an addition to our panel here. So we've been just discussing the U.S. economy, sort of not only in a specific way, like the definition of recession and how that's seemingly arbitrary, but also talking about some of the more basic concepts like profits falling. And so I guess since we were talking about the rate of profit and things, I think we should mention that the GDP sort of indicates that total value added, so literally what's being derived from labor, is lower, and it's becoming lower. And so that original definition, 2 months of, or 2 quarters of GDP shrinking, that's an indication here that value is becoming harder and harder to extract from labor due to the costs associated with maintaining capital because the organic composition is so high.
And did we talk about how capital, what is their solution to this crisis? Or how is it that they respond to whenever this happens? Because this happens, these are not once in a lifetime occurrences.
Yes.
No, they're cyclical. And like Marx in his time would say the solution to that is war. It's the destruction of constant capital, which led me out of curiosity to look into GDP in Russia leading into their invasion of Ukraine, just to see if it was purely geopolitical in nature and an inter-imperialist rivalry, or if there might have been some of that financial motivation as well. But at least Russia's reported GDP was actually quite positive leading into the Ukraine invasion. The US, on the other hand, who's supplying arms to Ukraine right now and instigating further tensions, is not.
So you mentioned that you were looking into the GDP of Russia to see if this was purely out of in an economic sense, their reasoning for starting this war. What do you think that reasoning would be for starting this war?
Well, I was looking to see if there was an economic underpinning, and there doesn't seem to be, at least not with the published numbers. I mean, there's always money to be made in war. So Russian capitalist firms will come out on top. There's also the grain issue that just occurred, where they brokered a deal for Ukrainian grain to be sent to like the Middle East and Africa and parts of Asia. Because indirectly this imperialist conflict is causing famine in those locations because Russia and Ukraine are the primary suppliers of grain there. So there's money to be made, and there's room for Russia and like Chinese imperialism to take deeper root. But I don't think that this was directly a byproduct of a flagging economy, at least not on the numbers I've seen so far. I think it was a expression purely of inter-imperialist rivalries right now.
I would agree with the imperialist rivalry part, especially because this isn't specifically about Russia and Ukraine, but just going back to our previous discussion when we were talking about the organic composition of capital, like it's the financial crisis leads to the devaluation of capitalism with the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. and how that affects businesses and like capitalists as a whole, like on a wider scale. So that in order for that to resume, capital to resume, you need to expand the accumulation process. So that ended up leading to more concentrated and centralized capitalist production. And then looking for cheap raw materials and investments in less developed areas, really just places with a lower organic composition of capital, was meant to compensate for the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And extending that into the world market, that's really what led to the rise of imperialism. And like, just looking back in history, every imperialist war has sort of followed the same pattern, regardless of the details of the geopolitical conflicts going on at the area of the time. A lot of these conflicts have sort of followed a similar formula, in the sense that the imperialist rivalries really are behind all of it. It's not so much as like a whole ethnic battle type thing as media tries to portray it.
The economy is like an international global creature. And I think like what we're seeing right now with a proxy war being fought really between Ukraine and Russia is a vindication of Bukharin's imperialism and world economy. As much as I love my man Lenin, like his interpretation, would lead us to believe that like a support of Ukraine right now would somehow undermine that imperialist order. But like every conflict since those texts were written kind of goes further and further to vindicate Bukharin's view, where imperialism is a ladder and every country is a part of it. And like, so right now we're seeing a waning American imperialism confronting a waxing Chinese and Russian like conjoined imperialism. Like I was seeing in the news today that Russia is reaching out to so-called rogue states in the Middle East, like Syria, to kind of reinforce their support in that block of nations as well. Like these rivalries are inescapable. And I feel like that side of this conflict is obviously never touched on in bourgeois sources. Like not even remotely. It's painted as a good guy, bad guy situation, even though it's being fought between two conscript armies that dissent against either nation, like either bourgeois nation within its borders is illegal. Like Ukraine was executing men of fighting age at the start of this war at the border who were trying to flee for asylum because they were between the ages of 18 and 60 and in fighting shape. Also, and none of this is like ever mentioned because it goes contrary to that good guy, bad guy narrative. And the reason Ukraine is a good guy, not just because Russia initiated the invasion, but because they were attempting to be a NATO ally.
Become a NATO ally, yes. Can we talk a little briefly about... and honestly, sometimes it still even shocks me, the almost racialist tones that a lot of media, especially like op-eds, are using to describe not just Vladimir Putin or the Russian military, but just Russians as a whole. I think back to Anne Applebaum, who I think she writes for the Washington Post, and she fancies herself like a scholar of the Soviet Union, which you can only imagine what those works are like. But she uses this very, like, ascribing entire characteristics to all of the Russian people, where she'll say things like, well, Russians are known to be very aggressive. They're very hostile towards anything that threatens their sense of power or supremacy over each other. And this kind of sentiment is echoed very much in a lot of media. And especially, like I mentioned, in the opinion sphere of American newspapers, at least, well, I only really read American newspapers.
Well, that makes sense, right? Because you have to drum up support for the intervention in the region. So especially on behalf of Ukraine. So if you paint Russians as this aggressive, quote unquote, race, then yeah, it's easy to say like, oh, if all Russians are like this, then of course we need to defend Ukraine from the evil Russians. I mean, that's just kind of how it goes.
Exactly.
So.
And
Yeah,
of course,
Andromeda.
against Russians outside of Russia is also entirely justified, or maybe not even. Maybe that's not what they desire, but they understand it's an inevitable outcome of that kind of rhetoric. I remember right in the outset of the war, Russian restaurants and stores being vandalized. I remember one in DC had a rock thrown through it, and of course, that's the logical conclusion to that kind of just. I said racialist before, and I'll say it again because that is what it is, at least to me. It is the ascribing of these entire characteristics, these negative characteristics and traits to an entire ethnic group of people. I don't know what else you would call that.
Oh yeah, I just it's a really good point you bring up. I wanted to add on a few things. First of all, like I think that is a tactic that the ruling class uses to get people to support national liberation movements and also to divide the working class. Because when you see the people, like the citizens, working class people who live in that country as the same as the government, that makes it easier to discard them and really see them as another side in an imperialist war. It's a us versus them mentality, and it's like saying things like it's essentially treating the Russian working class as the same as the Russian state. Does this happen? This happens a lot for other conflicts as well, like with Palestine, Israel, yeah, Iraq, Iran. Everyone, like in terms of these imperialist wars and national liberation movements, it's portrayed as like everyone in that ethnic category somehow has the same interests and they go against the interests of this other racial or ethnic group, and it really makes no sense at the end of the day, because it's like the national bourgeoisie of one country like still exploits the working class of that country, regardless of whether or not they're the same or different ethnicities. Like with Bangladesh, for example, there is a Bangladeshi bourgeoisie, and they're doing great. Like they're living large. Like, and it's the Bengali. Meanwhile, the Bengali working class, like they can barely afford food to feed their families. Like it's a common tactic that has historically been used by the ruling class to divide the working class so that we don't unite based on our class interests and focus more on differences in identity. And this also doesn't take into account the people who are both Russian and Ukrainian. Like I know many people have both. Like I have a lot of Russian friends who have Ukrainians in their family and vice versa. And it's sort of like you're essentially saying that like, oh, like one part of your family is the enemy. Like how ridiculous is that?
And
Not to mention, sorry, I just wanted to say one more thing. Not to mention that there was like a rise in hate crimes when it initially happened, like even in the United States. I know in New York, even a friend of a friend had gotten beat up by a random person because she was speaking to her mother on the phone and like in Russian. And so they assumed that she was Russian, and she was actually Ukrainian. I think a lot of Ukrainians also speak Russian,
Well, that's
and yeah.
that was something I wanted to bring up, is that people seem to forget that there is a non-insignificant population of Russian Ukrainians, ethnically Russians, living in Ukraine, have always lived in Ukraine. They speak Russian. And go figure, they have been completely ostracized. Violence against them has increased. There was videos of people just browbeating anyone who spoke, or people who thought they spoke any Russian, just being screamed at by other Ukrainians. And your story about the friend of the friend really does hammer in kind of something where, the irony of that situation is that that person was Ukrainian, but in the eyes, I'm just imagining, like, if they were able to tell their assailant that, they would feel bad, but they wouldn't feel bad about just beating up a random Russian on the street. That just shows how far people are just internalizing this as a conflict between good ethnicities and bad ethnicities, and a conflict between peoples, not between actual states.
So is there an actual distinction, like, other than, like, what is the ethnic distinction other than the language spoken?
Exactly. What is, and people get mad when you point this out, but, and I responded this to someone who is basically trying to say that, look at this Ukrainian woman, beautiful, strong. Look at this Russian woman, weak, old and frail. And I just quote tweeted them by saying, like, the genetic difference between the average Russian and Ukrainian is like 0.0001%. A lot of this is an artificial distinction. You think that guy knows the difference between Ukrainian and Russian? Obviously he did not. Or like any cultural characteristics of Ukraine, anything historical characteristics of Ukraine. All they know is that it's a good nation that we are either to support or not support, depending on which side of the aisle you decide to choose. And that's about it.
Well, and these kinds of conflicts will always be boiled down to those terms. Like, the modern nation state is the creation of, like, the bourgeois norm. Like, it's the byproduct of 1776 and 1848. Like, it's the expression of capitalist character, like this conception of the nation. And like, it's historical to the epoch that we live in. And then to use that to divide the international working class, like, is just too effective to not do it. And I think it's our role as communists to point that out. Like, the internationalism was lost in the communist movement with the rise of Stalinism. And, I think that's one of the things we're aiming to bring back, is that recognition that, like, the working class of Ukraine has more in common with the working class of Russia than either do with the bourgeoisies of their respective nations. And the same is true for, like, all working people all over the world. Our interests are uniform. We're feeding our families, we're going to work, we're toiling. And as are theirs, they're consolidating profit.
Yes.
And anything that adds, like, a barrier to that, whether it be like bourgeois lines on a map or like a cultural distinction, is ultimately a tool that the bourgeoisie of any nation, acting in the interests of any imperialism, can ultimately gain benefit from.
Yeah. But you mentioned that as of now, especially in this, what seems to be a brand new era of imperial conflict, obviously with news of America, Taiwan, and China. We have the war in Ukraine. It is now more important, more than ever, to get out the internationalist perspective, the class perspective. As we mentioned, as the saying goes, no war but the class war. But how, and what can we do as, I think, some of us are pretty isolated from any other organization or activity, like myself. What can we, just as people, do to help spread this in any way we can.
Well, I think like the most important thing that like any communist can do is talk to the people involved in their lives, talk to your coworkers and your friends. Like, I feel like a broken record, but like I advocate for communist stances in all times, in all things. And I generally try to do so without being like a LARPy weirdo. Everybody knows my politics, but like while most of them would claim that they have disagreements with me, when I actually bring up more like working class issues, it's generally met with agreement and support. And like I think the role that we need to play right now, like in this period of like low revolutionary potential, is to act as like the consciousness for the communist movement, to keep it moving forward, but also to act as the keeper of its legacy and to remember these lessons that we've learned from the workers' movement for 250 years. You know, the class moves on, but like it's our job to like remember that and to bring those things up and to learn from like failures in the past.
I agree. That's a good point, Tom. And also to add on to that, I think what we can do is embrace revolutionary defeatism. Like, not only should we call for the defeat of the ruling class in each imperialist party, we should also support the working class of each country. And in addition to that, we should call for the defeat of our own governments in our own countries that we live in. And that could mean, like, I know that sounds vague and abstract at the moment, especially given that it's like a proxy war and there's Ukraine and that there are like American soldiers and stuff signing up to go to Ukraine, things like that, volunteers. Like,
Yeah.
there are those situations, and I think one thing we can do potentially, not exactly related to Ukraine and Russia specifically, but just seeing where the U.S. is involved currently in terms of like imperialist conflicts and organizing against like those types of things. If you get what I mean.
Yeah, and you do, I guess, something I want to, and you touched upon it, but revolutionary defeatism, it seems like a more difficult task to do when you live in a country that is not directly involved in the war as any boots on the ground. It's a proxy war for them, and also you have an entirely volunteer army as opposed to the conscript system currently being used by Russia and Ukraine. Like you mentioned that Americans are going over there to fight, but they're not being conscripted into doing that. They are deciding to sign up and go do that.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
like I feel
Materialist analysis doesn't prevent individuals from acting in those manners also.
And so in terms of this conflict, the only thing we've been feeling from this war is, I guess, economics based. I'm trying to think of, there was something connected. Obviously, grain to Africa and the Middle East was hampered because of the conflict. But I don't think we have that same level of effect on us. And obviously, I know there is an effect to some degree. I'm just saying I don't think a lot of people are perceiving that as this situation is because of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia.
No, it's a much more abstract concept, like here in the United States. And I think that's part of why the morality play works so well. Mm-hmm. Like, while in Ukraine, like, something like 200 soldiers are dying a day and 36 civilians in a war that's being predominantly fought through artillery placements. So it's like you're not even seeing the person who's killing you. Like it could be like from 15 or 50 miles away.
Even wars.
But like the concept of revolutionary defeatism, like it was originally Lenin originally advocated it in the presence of a stronger workers' movement. So I think like we need to, with the question of like what do communists need to do, I think we need to recognize that right now we're impotent to make change in this conflict at this time outside of the people immediately around us and the reach of our organization. However, the goal is to bring more people in to increase that awareness and like that consciousness among the communists and like within the entirety of the class to stop the next war. And like, you know, we don't just sit back and like hide behind our keyboards. Like if there's a popular movement against this war, I think all four of us would be present there to advocate for our stances and bring them to the forefront to the best of our abilities. But in this current situation, I think the outreach that we're attempting to do is probably the most useful thing we can do, because Ukrainians and Russian conscripts and dissenters and protesters being beaten don't really care what our stances are. They're immaterial to their daily reality.
I think this is a good point to tie in, you know, since you mentioned that, you know, it is our job to advocate against that next war. We are seeing such an increase in activity or in imperialist rivalry between the US and China right now. And that is being exacerbated, of course, very recently by Pelosi's trip to Taiwan.
So when I see Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, my initial reaction is, I cannot conceive of any good reason why she would even do this. This seems like a very stupid move that was only ever going to exacerbate tensions between Taiwan, the United States, and China. What could have compelled her or for the United States to even do this? And that's the question I ask for, you know.
I guess I'll just mention, it's kind of interesting. I just am pulling up the first Google hit. Why did Pelosi go to Taiwan? And, you know, The Guardian is here saying, you know, this is such a reckless thing to do. Like, even they seem to be asking this question, which is, you know, I guess that's kind of telling that, you know, this isn't all totally coordinated in a, you know,
there's conflict among the bourgeoisie.
Exactly.
As well.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at.
So the policy of the United States towards Taiwan is actually officially strategic ambiguity. So it's not supposed to make any sense. And like, on one hand, the United States recognizes China and China does not recognize Taiwan. But the United States also recognizes Taiwan and its like parliament or democracy that they have there. So like the situation never makes sense, and it's always at the whims of saber-rattling politicians. And like, as to why Pelosi herself chose to go there, honestly, that's a fantastic question. But it does display like the animosity that the hot bourgeoisie in the United States feels towards its Chinese competition. Like, because I mean, China and Russia are part of the same like imperial bracket that the United States is currently in competition against. So indirectly, this is another antagonism by U.S. imperial interests against those of the Russian-Chinese bloc. And now we've got live missile fire exercises over the island of Taiwan and into Japanese waters.
Do you think this was done to essentially try to call the Chinese their bluff? Or do you think they were trying to figure out like what would be the response of the Chinese if we are to push the envelope this much?
I think probably the latter. Because, you know, this was, I believe the military exercises were in response to this visit. And so, you know, that sort of forces China to show their hand a little bit, or at least partially. So now we get to see, for China itself, it's a demonstration to their own population that, here's our strength. We're not going to just be humiliated by this. But for the United States, it's like, okay, here are the things they're going to deploy in an actual conflict. These are the weapons they're going to use.
But even that doesn't really make all that much sense, because it's not like we don't know what China's military is capable of. It's not like we have no information on this stuff. I could have predicted that they're going to do live fire drills and send in their navy to patrol around the waters near Taiwan. I could have made that prediction, and I'm not a sitting congresswoman from California.
I guess that's a good point. And with all the spy technology that the United States has at its disposal, they probably have already seen this hardware before. Perhaps it's more of a tactical thing, like how will they deploy? And I'm just guessing at this point. I don't really know what the point of all this is, of course. I think we're all just kind of guessing.
Yeah, I don't think any of us can really know right now. And especially with a figure like Pelosi who's so polarizing. And I don't think anybody in this discussion didn't have a formed opinion of Nancy Pelosi prior to having this discussion. And that also will kind of affect your perception of things. She had to know what the outcome of this would be. But why did she choose to do it when she did? I don't think any of us can know right now, because none of us can read minds. But the increasing tension that it inevitably triggered just kind of adds to a simmering new Cold War between the US and China. And I think Pelosi has to be as aware as anyone that China and its imperial sphere aren't yet in a place of development where open war would be beneficial to them. This isn't a World War I, World War II situation yet, even though it is trending in that direction. Maybe the goal is to see to what extent they'll tolerate these hostilities with impending open war on the distant horizon. Or maybe she wanted to drive her name recognition in the news. It's kind of hard to say.
Did Pelosi do this on behalf of the United States, or was this just a personal visit for her?
The latter.
Really?
China has blamed the Biden administration for the diplomatic fallout, but Pelosi undertook this trip to Taiwan entirely of her own volition as a private American citizen and not as part of the envoy of the Biden White House.
Because I thought oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Nothing. I was just saying that's interesting that she did it as her own instead of as part of the administration.
Yeah, I was going to say, I always thought it was the former, and the first thing I remember thinking to myself is, why did they send her? Why is the Speaker of the... Is she even the Speaker of the House?
Yes, she is.
Okay, why would they send the Speaker of the House to go to Taiwan for a business trip? I was usually you would send Secretary of State or any other number of diplomats, not just a congresswoman.
I guess she knows too. I don't know.
I mean, she is number 2 in the order of succession. So, if Biden were to pass away, then after Harris, it would be Pelosi. So, this is a woman who's been deeply involved in national politics for 40 years. And she's aware of that as well, that everyone is aware that she's number 2 in line, the third option for the president, which does indirectly make her representative of the office of the presidency. I know that if I were in her shoes, I would view my actions as having a like 1 degree of separation from the White House as an institution.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like you're exactly right. Because when I think of Democrats, I think of Nancy Pelosi. Like that's who I think of first. So that would make sense.
Is there anything else we have to say about this conflict? I mean, I think we kind of covered everything that has already happened so far, unless new developments are coming out. But if they have, I haven't seen them yet.
No, I think that's about where we're about up to date right now with where the reporting is on that one.
As a final topic, why don't we talk about the recent outbreak of monkeypox?
I think we're going to have a lot more diseases coming out in our lifetimes.
Yeah, that's probably true due to
that's a response of ecological catastrophe.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, we've had many discussions on this with regard to the COVID pandemic. The fact is, the bourgeoisie is simply incapable of responding to these things in a way that actually protects people.
Yeah, it's entirely contrary to the underlying logic, with all of these capitalist systems, and even in nationalized systems, the nationalized healthcare system doesn't operate outside of the system of capital. It's still beholden to it, and because of that, you're seeing retractions in national healthcare systems all over Europe. So not even nationalization in the US would fix this problem. It's part and parcel to the greater social configuration, i.e. capital that we live in.
Exactly. And you know what is even more ridiculous? The fact that a while ago when the first outbreaks of monkeypox had been happening, they had said that the UN was not concerned about monkeypox causing a global pandemic. She said it was because public health authorities had a window of opportunity to contain the outbreak. But infection. Exactly. So the infectious disease experts, they're concerned that health authorities have failed to contain the outbreak, and because of this, monkeypox is going to permanently take root in countries where it previously was not found. So this essentially means that this could have been it could have been contained. There was literally a window of opportunity to do so, but public health officials failed to, just like they did with COVID.
Well, and if they actually contained it, that might have negative effects on the flow of capital and workers internationally.
Exactly.
And we can't have that. That would be putting people before profits. So this is the same thing that we're just going to keep seeing.
Exactly, because people's health are not it's not profitable, it's only profitable in the sense that with COVID, people were compensated so only for a short amount of time so that they could you not be in crisis, although a lot of people were in crisis and no one did anything to help them. So yeah, essentially they missed the window of opportunity because it wasn't profitable for them to care about it. But even with COVID, they were only caring about it in a short amount of time so that people were at least alive to be able to work. They only cared about people's health so as that they're healthy enough to work. Where beyond that, they do not care. And as long as you're able to go to your job, perform at it, and then that's all they care about. They don't care if you're dying in the process. And that honestly is one of the reasons why it's led to this, like, it happened with COVID, and I can see it happening with monkeypox, not because of the severity of the virus or the illness. I think if it does become a more major concern, it will be directly because of the failures of these public health authorities at containing it. And yeah, it was the UN Health Agency that had not been concerned about it prior. And it's essentially like these government organizations, like, are really just they're not even really reporting science as it is. They're they're altering it to fit the interests, like their own class interests, and portray a certain narrative that will make people just do what they say in terms of like following like health protocols. Like they are not actually going to implement anything that's useful to people. Like there are vaccines going on right now for monkeypox, but we're already in a shortage. Like, how has it just started and there's already a limited supply of vaccines? Apparently, they said that instead of one dose, they're going to break it up into 5 for people. Yeah, so that they can have a little bit of protection, yet stretch it out so that more people can have it. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? I think that's ridiculous.
Do you think part of the reason why such a poor response to this is because it is not considered a pandemic? It's considered an epidemic. Is it even considered an epidemic yet?
No, but like, I feel like it will be because it wasn't contained when it should have been.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm trying to say is, you think they kind of just decided to run the risk and basically say to themselves, we'll cross that bridge when it gets there. When it becomes a national emergency, then we'll pull out all the. Well, even then, they're not going to pull out. They're going to pull out all the stops. We'll take this seriously.
Didn't they learn their lesson with COVID?
No, they
Clearly
didn't.
Not remotely.
Oh my god.
I think the reason why is because they saw how much the lockdown did fuck up with the economy. And remember, this was just like a funny progression in the media of all these newspapers, all the media saying, we need to lock down, we gotta go do remote work. And now all of a sudden the New York Times have just run like a huge series of op-eds like, what if going to physical work was actually really good for you? Like, you should love going to work.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, they saw that this is starting to hurt them, and they've decided they've had enough. Well, and like, I believe even during when it was at the height of the pandemic, a lot of politicians and members of the media were saying, look, I know this pandemic is still raging on, but we gotta get this economy. They were saying we need to get this economy going. They were saying the quiet part out loud.
You know the reason why they want us to go back to work like in person?
I can think of several reasons, but what do you think?
Because they, like, the employers, they have to rent out the buildings and stuff.
Yeah,
so it's like if they don't get their employees in going there, then they're losing money by renting it.
I heard it was just the real estate market is hurting. I think another issue is it just gives you a lot more control. Mm-hmm. If you're a manager or a boss or an overseer or something like that, it is easier to like walk around and oversee your subordinates than it is to be on Zoom and not know what they're doing for most of the day. Because, and this is something that needs to be brought up, productivity has increased greatly over the past decades, but the work hours have stayed the same. So if you are just working at home, what's stopping you from doing the 3 hours of work you need to get all your stuff done and then just taking the rest of the day off?
The hourly wages system.
For that day. They want you for that day. Doesn't matter if you're
Exactly.
doing nothing. Doesn't matter if you're doing Sudoku. They want you present, and they want you in case they need you to do something right then and there.
Also, to add on to that, the time it takes to commute to work, to and from work, that's
Yeah.
not compensated, but that's sort of like expected for you to compartmentalize as part of your workday. That's an everyday routine that you are expected to really do, and you're not compensated for any of that.
Yeah. You pay to go to work. Yes.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do. I spent so much money on these Ubers last week because I was running late to work, and I had to spend like an overpriced amount. It's the worst.
I'm very thankful that my job only requires me to drive 20 minutes to there, and I like my job.
Ooh, don't say that.
Well,
No.
I can't help it. I enjoy the thing I do.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like I enjoy the thing that I do, but I hate having to do it as an obligation to survive. I hate having to come in at the same time every day and like being forced to stay for that. And I hate wage labor.
Yes, very. Obviously, yes, and I have grown more cynical about money. But strangely enough, at least for me, it hasn't been about my job itself, but more of just how everything costs money, how every interaction, even just me trying to get to work, yes, that costs money, and that is why I hate wage labor and just commodities in general.
Well, yeah, you're confronted by it with every facet of society. Like nothing is immune from the reach of capital and its logic. Not our work, obviously, which is alienated. Not our commute to that work, but not even the things that we do in our leisure. Everything, like consciously or subconsciously, goes through the superstructure of capitalism. I think it bends to that logic before we can even receive it.
A part of it has to do with I'm doing this job. I'm working full time this summer so I can save up as much as I can for school.
Mm-hmm.
And that only leaves me with, at the end of 2 weeks of doing, and like I said, I enjoy what I do, but it is physically taxing. I get home and I am very tired by the end of the day, and I only have the weekends really. I don't really have much I can do. Just this week, I was putting back doing my oil change and buying air conditioning fluid for my car because it was gonna cost me like $100, $150, and I just thought to myself, I don't want to spend that money right now.
I feel the same. I'm dealing with the same issue in terms of mine. My work and experience as well. I just wanted to go back to our discussion on monkeypox. There's just one more thing I wanted to add. Another thing that has been bothering me a lot is the fact that this whole monkeypox, all the cases that are popping up, the media is really portraying it as an issue that's primarily affecting gay men, and it really brings up a lot of parallels to the AIDS epidemic and the discrimination and homophobia that was outright against gay men, and it was very publicly acceptable to be homophobic in that manner. And it's really concerning to see similar tactics being used for monkeypox, especially when it's not even an STD.
Just justification of homophobia.
Yeah, exactly.
There was this horrifying comic that was circulating on Twitter by this reactionary comic artist who has done some stuff in the past where it's basically insinuating that children who are getting monkeypox, because there are now cases of children getting monkeypox, are getting it because gay people just love molesting children.
God,
and
that's
loved it.
horrible.
That's been like a
horrible.
major talking point with the reactionaries since the QAnon thing started.
Mhm.
And it's really super disgusting. Like, the phrase groomer has become like almost a slur, where it's actually like a useful designation of an abuser. Like, and
of course,
it's like it ties into the othering that we were talking about based on nationality before with Ukraine. Like, oh, the media narrative is like, oh, we don't have to worry about this because this is the new gay disease. Like, even if like gay men were disproportionately affected by monkeypox, like, because that's where like an initial outbreak started, that could have been reported in like a helpful and positive manner to help that community and to prevent further transmissions. But instead, the media saw an opportunity to demonize a sexual minority that's already dealing with like increased scrutiny as the reactionaries push back against them.
Exactly. And also that not only does it harm gay people who are being discriminated against because of
but also,
this disease, it also like lets people like think they're safe. They're like, oh, I'm not gay, I'm safe from this monkeypox. But it's not true, because it spreads from skin to skin contact. It doesn't spread through like sex inherently.
And-
Just any form of skin to skin contact. Like, anyone is at risk. It just happened to be disproportionately gay men. Sorry, he could.
It reminds me of in Dallas Buyers Club, where he finds out he has AIDS and he just denies it because he perceives it solely as a gay person's disease, and he's not gay. And he gets mad at trying to basically, in his mind, his doctor is basically saying that he's gay. But the real way he got it is because he was using a dirty needle. And like, I knew it wasn't a purely sexually transmitted disease, but the fact that it is just skin to skin contact, that makes that comic insinuating that like this kid got monkeypox because he was touched by a gay man in a sexual manner even more revolting. Because any skin contact, okay, great. Yeah, sure. All these kids are getting it because gay men are just raping children. Sure.
It's a terrible way that they're framing it in the media, and I think a lot of people are also like falling for this homophobic rhetoric, and it's really concerning that a lot of the same themes from the AIDS epidemic are going to pop up again.
I do want to point out that this prejudice is being amplified not only by the media, but by entities like the WHO, who have, their response to all this, because they're completely ineffectual, is...
our objective sources, as many would like to think of them as.
Yeah. Their response is to recommend that gay and bisexual men limit sexual partners.
Awesome.
And that's it. So instead of anything meaningful, that's all we get.
Again, it's done through skin contact, and they know this, but their recommendation is just stop having gay sex.
It's not even a sexually transmitted disease. It's by skin to skin contact. You can literally shake someone's hand and get it. That's a really good point, Seamus, by the way, that you brought up, because like the WHO and the CDC as well, like they really portray themselves as like these objective health experts with no biases, but it's not true. Like, real scientists would not be okay with those ethics violations. Like there are a code of ethics for scientists, and these the World Health Organization, clearly not abiding by these.
It is. I'm just remembering back about all that thing about Fauci. We're just like treating him like he's the science man. But people who are like looking back on the pandemic, he did mess things up. These people are not infallible. And the more we think that they're infallible, the more massive their screw-ups are going to be.
Yeah,
because if no one even bothers to like question it, and of course, like obviously, there's a difference between questioning whether or not this virus is. Well, I'm talking about Fauci again. Whether or not this virus is a real thing, and questioning the way he's going about trying to clamp down on it. But I think because we have, I don't even know what it is, this weird obsession with technocrats, so the idea of like the smart guy in power, and towards that makes you like they'll paint you out as a trying to deny the thing itself.
Another example of that mentality just failing was when the Delta CEO basically said publicly, we need to reduce the isolation time for COVID to 5 days instead of 10. And then, without any data showing that this is a wise thing to do.
No, it was purely economically driven.
Exactly. The CDC just goes and says, okay, that's fine. And so does Fauci. I think he publicly said, oh, yeah, that's fine.
Well, and when you look at the infection rate graph, it's a bell curve. And that extra day made a huge difference or the extra 2 days really would have made a huge difference for the transmission of COVID, because like the level of virility in a patient at 5 days is still pretty significantly higher than what anybody would have tolerated if they'd actually looked at the infection rates. But at 8 days, it was acceptable. But 5 days turns it into one average working week, whereas 8 days drags it into 2. Mm-hmm. And so we get a 5-day non-scientific change to the isolation protocol. And the graphs that were in that release from the CDC showed that their own argument was like irrelevant. It was purely an economically based decision. And as are all under capitalism.
It's ridiculous. Very good point, though, Tom. And so, yeah, exactly. That's because they only want to give us 5 days. They only want to pay us for 5 days off of work. They don't want to pay us for any more than that. So it doesn't matter however long the virus is still in your body or however long you're contagious for. What matters is that you go back to work and continue producing value. Since you bring that up, that reminds me, I wanted to ask you, like, as a healthcare provider, how do you feel about this whole sharing doses thing? Well, not exactly sharing doses, but like using the five counts of the vaccine instead of 1 because of the limited supply.
I was astounded when you brought that to my attention. Like, that's not the way medicine works. Medicine is intended to be evidence-based. And like, that's not to say that there isn't a chance that the dosages that were originally tested in that vaccine wouldn't be efficacious, like if they were cut in half or something, but we just don't know. And so why are we going to give someone 1/5 of potentially nothing? Like, why are we going to use the working class as as a case study for like proof of concept? Like, it's just not the way medicine is intended to be performed. Also, my understanding when this whole thing first started was that monkeypox could be managed through the United States' inventory of smallpox vaccine, and of which we have like a national stockpile because smallpox is useful as a biological agent. And apparently that's not the case. And apparently only 2 of them can work. And apparently one of them is quite dangerous. And now we're talking about doing 1/5 dose pop. Like, I don't even know where that number could have come from. And that's not the way medicine is intended to be done.
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. And now that you brought it up, it reminds me, that's not how science works in terms of trialing vaccines anyway, because technically you first with a vaccine, you do controlled experimental trials to see if it's efficacious, and then it gets rolled out to the general public to determine effectiveness. But how can you determine whether it's efficacious if the results from the previous, samples they had measured the full dose? Like, unless they've actually gone and done these trials and have basically replicated those results, then it's not scientific, because you're right. The 1/5 dose technically might not actually do anything, and it might not be enough. And they can't know that unless they've done randomized control trials.
And now the working class is going to be that control. And all because we couldn't prepare in advance, even just a couple of months, for a pandemic that might potentially impact the profit margins of pharmaceutical companies. They could have started running off new, greater doses of a medicine that we know already works, but instead we're talking about rationing it to 20% its intended dose, with apparently no supporting science.
All right, well, I think we will wrap up our discussion for today. You have been listening to the IWG Podcast, aka
The Left
Comcast. So we will be back in a couple weeks.
We'll see you until then.